was to memorize and transmit those texts accurately. What is perhaps even more amazing is that there are people in India today who still have that ability to recite some of these texts from memory, despite the fact that they are in many cases long, complex, and in an archaic form of the Sanskrit language, at least until we get to the Upanishads. Now, the Vedic texts can be divided in two ways. The first way is the way which I call the vertical divisions. And what I mean by that is that the Vedic texts were transmitted over the centuries in a number of different traditions. Specifically, they were transmitted in the four traditions of the Rig Veda, the Samaveda, the Yajur Veda, and the Atharva Veda. Each of those traditions spawned its own sub-traditions, so that within, for example, the tradition of the Rig Veda would be a number of sub-traditions. And each of those sub-traditions, at least initially, had its own distinctive forms of spiritual and religious practice, its own distinct texts that carried the teachings of those particular practices. What is difficult to do this far removed in time from that period is necessarily to put any individual text that we have into one or other of those particular sub-traditions. But what we can do is, generally speaking, put our texts into one or other of the four main subdivisions, the four main traditions, those of the Rig Veda, Samaveda, Yajur Veda, and Atharva Veda. So that when we get to look at the Upanishads, each of those Upanishads, at least nominally, belongs to one or other of those traditions. And the tradition to which the Upanishad belongs will, to some extent at least, influence both the contents of that Upanishad and perhaps how it presents those contents. Again, there's a word of caution needed here in that the association of some of the later Upanishads with these strands of Vedic thought are a little bit loose. It's quite hard to see any particular relationship between the Upanishad and one or other of these traditions. And so by default, those Upanishads often are associated with the tradition of the Atharva Veda. But very often that is, or appears to be, a default attribution rather than one based in any reality that we can assess. Different with some of the other Upanishads. In many cases, the Upanishads that we have originally formed parts of other Vedic texts. So we can see from the tradition in which those other texts were compiled where our Upanishads belong. Somewhere along the line, and it's difficult to say exactly when or how this happened, but somewhere along the line, parts of those texts were extracted, and having become extracted, were given a life of their own as separate texts called Upanishads. Now, as well as the four traditions, the Rig Veda, Samaveda, Yajur Veda, and Atharva Veda tradition, we can also divide the Vedic corpus of texts in what I call a horizontal way. What I mean by that is that within each tradition, there are different classes, different types of text. To begin with, we have texts called the Samhitas, which literally means collections. And those are in fact the texts which are sometimes simply referred to